Hello and welcome to another exciting lecture for research methods. In this lecture, we're going to be talking about ethics in research. So what we're going to look at in this chapter, we're going to look at ethics as a whole with the learning objective of being able to identify ethical concerns in research. Then we'll look at some history of ethical or specifically unethical research and why we have the ethics rules we have today. So the learning objective there is going to be to describe some of the major historical studies and their corresponding ethical violations. We're going to talk about the Belmont report, and that's basically the ethical principles. So you should be able to list the 3 ethical principles in the Belmont report, which all research needs to adhere to now. Then we'll look at the APA Standard 8. There are 10 APA standards for various different things within psychology. APA Standard 8 is for research in psychology. So the learning objective here is understand the APA Standard 8 guidelines and how they apply to research. And finally, we'll just finish up with a little bit on fraud and plagiarism. So that's not necessarily ethics in research, that's ethics in publication or ethics in conveying of meaning, conveying of research. So the learning objective here is demonstrate an understanding of how to avoid committing plagiarism. And you guys should be able to do this really well because that's one of the major concerns when you come to academic writing is avoiding plagiarism. So let's start with a question. This question it's a philosophical question. This question is, should psychologists use deception and or attempts to produce certain feelings in research participants? Should they use deception? Should they deceive the participants in any way or at various different levels of deception? If deception's allowed, where's the line? How about attempting to produce certain feelings in participants? So can you attempt to elicit anger, sadness, happiness, all of this in participants? Is it ethical or unethical to deceive participants? Is it ethical or unethical to produce feelings, certain feelings in participants? Now, I could go on about it here and answer that question, but this is actually something that I want to discuss in class. So you've got this as it is here, but I do want you to actually think about it and analyze it on a deeper level. So let's start with defining what is research ethics. So research ethics, as it's defined, is going to be the responsibility of researchers to be both honest and respectful to all individuals who are affected by their research studies or the reports of their study results. So there's an important distinction here. So honest and respectful. Kind of get to that deception we were talking about on the previous one. If you're deceiving, are you being honest? What are ways that you can use deception and still end up being honest? So it's the responsibility of researchers to be honest and respectful, so to have respect for individuals who are affected by their research studies. So in that case, we're talking about affected by the research study we're now looking at participants in the research study mostly. So you have to be honest and respectful to the participants as well as anybody else who might be involved in the research process. So it could be you've got lab assistants or Confederates. You need to also have ethical concerns for them. But just as important is the results or the reports of the study's results. So this is where things like anonymity are going to come in, or other things relating to that, because if you do a report on it and it causes harm to someone outside of the study, then that is something that would be unethical. So when it comes to research ethics, it's about reducing harm to both participants of the study and those who may be harmed as a result of the study. And it's guided by the American Psychological Association's ethical principles for research, and we will talk about those later. Let's look at some ethical concerns throughout the research process, that gets us to our first learning objective. And our first learning objective is identify the ethical concerns in research. So there is a number of concerns to have, and each study is different, and each study is going to have its own basically analysis of the ethics and the ethics concerns. However, research that's done today, it must follow a institutional review board. Each institution has an institutional review board that looks at ethics in research, and it approves or rejects research based on the ethical concerns. So if the IRB, Institutional Review Board, has concerns about the way participants or animals or anything is treated, if there's questions of ethics, ethical concerns there, then they can reject that research or ask for the research to be modified. So what are some things that could be concerns? Measurement techniques that are used. If you're trying to test to see someone's responses to a provoked stimuli, a measurement technique, you could be anything from just observing their behavior to taking blood, and maybe you want to get their hormone levels with a blood sample. Well, the measurement techniques, if you can't justify doing something like taking a blood sample, then that's unethical. How to select participants. If you're selecting participants in a way that is biased or going to systematically discriminate, then your selecting of participants can be unethical. What research strategies you use, what research design you use, both of these, and how to carry out the study. All of these things, there's potential things that are unethical in the process that need to be examined and make sure that proper ethics are being followed. And then how to analyze and report. Again, you don't want, with analyzing, you don't want any systematic discrimination. With reporting, you don't want to report it in such a way that it causes harm to someone. This is a big reason why one of the main tenets of research is anonymity, is that the results are anonymous, that participants aren't exposed as being a participant in a study. Let's expand on some of these. So the basic categories of research design. First, the two basic categories are going to be to ensure the welfare and dignity of participants and subjects. And then the second ethical concern is accuracy in reporting the research results. So I've been talking about things that cause harm mainly to participants, but just as important is the accurate reporting. If someone is lying in their reports, well, then future research directions, money, justifications for doing research that might have slight ethical concerns, if prior research is reported a certain way, it can actually influence future research. That is why one of the main ethical guidelines is that that journal articles and results are reported accurately, so that lying or deception does not occur in the reporting of results. And then this top one is the one I've been talking about to this point, is ensuring the welfare and dignity of the participants and subjects. One area of concern is that a researcher is in a position of power over participants, whether it is because the participants are required to be there for a class, though there should never be a point where research is required. There should be options. So even at universities where intro students in psychology are participants in research, You get that at a lot of research universities like University of Michigan. All of the intro students are required to participate in research. However, they're not required. There is always an alternate that they can do. So in the options of research to participate in at U of M, there is the option to just do a survey that takes an equal amount of time to the studies, and the results of that survey aren't used. They're just basically thrown away. But the point is it takes the same amount of time and effort to get the credit for participating in the research. But another thing that ends up happening is that researchers, because they're in that position of power, have the potential to harm the participants because of the position of power that they're in. We'll talk about the Milgram experiments a little bit later and how just the researcher being there influences participants' reactions to or their willingness to do various different things just because the researcher's there and the researcher's telling them to do it. This isn't a social psych class, so we're not going to talk about conformity too much and all that, but just know that many people have a desire to conform or follow what they're told from someone they perceive to be in charge. And researchers are perceived to be in charge, so the participants are going to follow what they say even if it goes against their better judgment or goes against their own ethical principles. And again, we'll look at Milgram in just a little bit and see why that's such a concern. Let's look at the historical now. And that gets us to our second learning objective, and that's describe some of the major historical studies and their corresponding ethical violations. So we're going to look at the ones we're going to look at here, 4 of them, even though there's way more than this. There's some that are just as bad, some that are just as big. You might hear them in intro, you might hear them in other classes. But the 4 we're going to look at here is the Tuskegee experiments, the Tuskegee study, which you see lasted all the way until the 1970s, Willowbrook State School, the Jewish Chronic Disease Hospital cancer experiments, and finally we'll finish with Milgram and talk a bit about Milgram there, as I just hinted at in the previous study, or in the previous slide. So let's start by talking about one of the worst, if not the worst, or most egregious unethical studies that has been done. Yes, there's been studies that are more unethical than this, that maybe didn't get reported, things that certain people conducted, experiments that certain people conducted, where it wasn't where it was just a private citizen doing this, not necessarily like this one, which this one was the government conducting these experiments. So this was a syphilis study that was conducted in Tuskegee, Alabama, and it started in 1932, and again, like I said, went all the way to 1972, and was designed to observe syphilis, and it wasn't supposed to be, it's not supposed to be generalized to black men, but it was, in this study, they were observing syphilis in black men for basically 6 to 8 months after they were infected with syphilis, and then treating them early on with contemporary drugs. These drugs were somewhat effective, but also highly toxic. The important thing to note here is that the researchers were working for the U.S. government. The researchers injected these people with syphilis. And in a lot of cases, they withheld treatment. And you notice that this timeline here goes all the way to 1972. Well, the important thing to note about it going all the way to 1972 is the fact that the scary thing there, or the very extremely unethical, I mean, it's unethical to infect people with a disease anyway, but the extremely unethical thing is that by the time this experiment was over, long before it was over, there was penicillin. Penicillin was discovered, and penicillin was found to be an effective treatment for syphilis. Let's see if I put it in the slides. Basically what it comes down to is that even though penicillin was discovered to treat syphilis, the researchers in this study refused to give the participants syphilis. They even discouraged them from getting, or refused to give them penicillin, sorry, and discouraged them from getting penicillin treatment because they knew it would treat the disorder, and the researchers wanted to basically figure out the course of syphilis. So 399 poor individuals, little knowledge of biomedical science, 201 similar men without syphilis were also included. Basically, before the study could begin, funding for the treatments was withdrawn. So this whole thing up here that they were going to treat them with contemporary drugs, now some of them did get treatments, various different treatments, but the big point is funding for the full treatments was removed. So what did they do? Did they stop the study? Did they not infect people with syphilis? No, they went on and conducted the study anyway so that they could obtain information on the course of syphilis. And some of these patients were observed for over 40 years, never getting treatment for the syphilis that they were basically infected with. And again, just basic ethical concerns you've got here. Informed consent wasn't given. They weren't informed that they were being basically given syphilis. They were told that they just had bad blood and that they could receive free medical treatment, rides to the clinic, meals, burial insurance in case of death in return for participating. All of this. And again, the other ethical concerns is a minority group was targeted. They were deceived. And then, as I already said on the previous one, by 1943, so 10 years, 11 years into this, penicillin had become the standard and effective treatment for syphilis. And it produced very few side effects, but not only were the participants not given penicillin, not even half of them, to make it a control where you give half of them penicillin and half not to see what the difference was. They were basically discouraged from enrolling in syphilis treatment programs outside of this study. So they weren't just deceived in what was going on in the study, they were deceived to the point where they were discouraged from seeking actual treatments that worked. And again, beyond that, many of the Tuskegee men, they tried to enroll in the armed forces, but they were rejected from serving because of their syphilis. And again, they were told to have their syphilis treated before they could enroll. And there was effective treatments. Penicillin was out by then, but the researchers worked to prevent this. So the researchers actively worked to keep these people infected with an illness that could result in death, and does result in death quite often. So many men died earlier than they should have, needlessly transmitted the disease to their spouses and children. Just all kinds of problems here. I don't need to go on and on and on about how many issues there are here. You can clearly see how big of an ethical violation this is. But again, the biggest thing here is this was a government-funded and run program. But let's look at these ethical concerns, looking at the specific ones. They were lied to about the nature of participation. They weren't allowed to provide informed consent, were prevented from getting safe medicine, experienced painful procedures, were prevented from enrolling in the armed forces. They transmitted the diseases to others. And as I already said, they targeted a disadvantaged social group because they knew they could get away with it. They knew they could, the researchers knew they could do the study on these participants, and that no one in the government would care. So just, again, just unethical all the way around. And it's actually because of this, and again, this isn't a social psych class, this isn't a health psych class, but we can look at some of the implications from this. And one of the things that we know is that there is a inherent distrust of medical professionals by many African Americans. And that distrust comes from things like this. It comes from things like the Tuskegee experiments and other studies that were conducted on people of color because they are from disadvantaged groups at the time. It wasn't viewed by the government or the researchers to be bad because, or as bad because of the group that the studies were done on. And again, just hugely unethical. Um, there's other things relating to that. I'm not going to go into too much with Henrietta Lacks. I'll just put this up here because I just said it, that there's this history of people from disempowered groups, from people of color, other minority groups being treated poorly by medical researchers. And what it comes down to is the fact that that has led to a mistrust of medical professionals by these groups. Henrietta Lacks, if you didn't know, she went to the doctor. She had cervical cancer. The doctor did a biopsy of the cervical cancer, didn't even tell her they were doing it, kept her cells, didn't tell her. She died shortly after of the cervical cancer. But they kept her cells, and her cells have the interesting and nearly unique property of being immortal. They're cells that basically refresh the Hayflick limit. The Hayflick limit is the amount of time cells can split. It's because of telomeres on the ends of the cells. The Henrietta Lacks cancer cells, they refresh the telomeres, so they don't break down. They're essentially immortal. They can keep splitting forever. And a lot of research labs around the world that still do research on cancer cells are doing research on the Henrietta Lacks cells. There's a few other sources that have been found since of immortal cells, but her cells are one of the early ones and by far the most popular immortal cells. It wasn't until many, many years later that the family, her kids and her grandkids were compensated for all of this research that had been done and all of this money that had basically been made off from her cells. I'm going to talk about two other instances of unethical research, scandals, if you want to call them that, before I get to the Milgram experiments. First is the Willowbrook State School of Staten Island, and this occurred in the 1950s. And basically, this was it was the institution for the retarded. That was what it was called. So that was the appropriate term at the time. It is no longer the appropriate term, but it was the appropriate term at the time. Children at that institute were fed extracts of stool from individuals infected with hepatitis. So in a sense, they were trying to see what happened. But they, again, another disadvantaged group, and the research was done on this group because, again, like I said, quite often there's this perception that they're less. So doing unethical research on people that are less means it's less unethical. Again, that's a very flawed way of thinking, but there's justifications that are made. Like in this case, the research director said that the children at the crowded facility would likely contract hepatitis anyway, so why not infect them so we can track the course of it. And parental permission here was obtained through misleading them about the lengthy admission process for non-participating children. They were basically told that if they participated in this study, their children could get admitted quicker. So that you're going to see when we talk about some of the ethics things later, how one of the big things that's important is that participation is voluntary and there can be no coercion into participation. This is a coercion into participation, what's going on right here, because they're basically saying to them that by participating in this study, you're guaranteeing that your child will get in admission versus a much longer and harsher admission process. It's why, like I was saying before, when we do research now, you have to, if you require research for any reason, you have to do an alternative. And then there's things like paying participants. If you're paying a participant to be in your study, are you coercing them into being in it? Being in your study? Are you coercing them to participating when they wouldn't normally participate? That's why the pay needs to be basically negligible. I paid basically $10 for an hour for participants to come into the lab. That's not negligible, but it's comparable to another job, so it's not like they were incentivized to participate for the money. That was just the bonus for their time. There's other countries. I have a colleague in Chile, and she does research very similar to my research. I've worked with her a few times on different studies. I almost went and did a postdoc with her after grad school. But the point there is that in Chile, you cannot pay participants at all. You can't even pay them a little bit, not even a tiny bit, because their ethics views it completely as any pay at all is coercion. So it's just something to be aware of. Another study was the Jewish Chronic Disease Hospital cancer experiments. So 22 chronically ill, debilitated non-cancer patients were injected with live human cancer cells to see what would happen. Let's just inject people with cancer to see what will happen. Oh, but wait, let's make sure that they come from a disadvantaged group, that they're already chronically ill, that all of this, so that's going to justify, right? No, obviously it doesn't. But that's the justification that they had in their heads of why it was okay, because these are already chronically ill children or patients. They were not told about the cancer cells because the researchers didn't want to stir up any unnecessary anxieties in the patients. So deception for the case of, with the argument of don't want to cause anxiety, and especially people who had phobia or ignorance about cancer. And this is another one that was funded by the government. This was funded by the American Cancer Society. So, and even after this experiment was over, the principal investigator in the study was elected to be the president of the American Cancer Society. So you see that even after this experiment was over, it just wasn't viewed as that big of a deal, and the primary researcher got rewarded, if anything. So again, this is another couple instances of some pretty unethical things that happen, and I could go on. We could do an entire semester on just going after one after another unethical experiments. I'm just trying to give an overview so you can see some of the things that have been done in the past. Modern times, there is very little unethical research that occurs simply because these past experiments opened up people's eyes to the unethical things that were going on. Which gets us to one of the biggest ones, and that is Milgram's obedience study. So in 1961, a former Nazi, high-ranking Nazi, basically had a lot to do with concentration camps, and he was captured and basically convicted and hanged in 1962 But his defense was, this defense you hear all the time, I was just following orders. And this gets us to the Milgram experiments. Because Stanley Milgram, wanted to know, would other people do the same in a similar circumstance? Now, you can't put people in the exact same circumstance, but Milgram designed this in such a way such that he wanted to find out if people would do something that would normally be unethical if they were put in a situation of following orders. Now, we've got this mentality. Before I even get to Milgram's experiment, we do still have this mentality, despite Milgram's experiments, which we'll talk about in a minute, that just following orders is not a good enough excuse. However, from a standpoint of looking at prior research, is that actually the case? Let's actually look at Milgram's study. So in Milgram's study, subjects were told that they'd been assigned the role of a teacher. So they were the teacher. They were up here as a teacher. There was a wall between them and the learner. So the wall there, and the learner was another subject in the experiment. They were told it was. It wasn't. It was a Confederate. It was somebody pretending to be in the experiment. But the point is they thought the learner was another person. The teacher was in front of a panel, and they had to ask questions. The teacher goes with the experimenter, and this is the important part. The experimenter is in the same room as the teacher. The teacher and the experimenter go into a room together, and the teacher's job is to give the learner, who's in another room, they can only hear each other through a microphone or through the wall. There's like a grate in the wall that they can hear them through, but they can't see each other. The teacher has to ask the learner memory questions, and if the learner gets the question wrong, the teacher has to give them a shock. It starts out as a very small shock, and as the more and more questions wrong, the shock goes up and up and up to the point where the teacher is told, or it's marked on it, that the top shock is potentially lethal. There also, the teacher was sometimes told in various different experiments, the teacher was told that the learner may have had a heart condition. So getting electrical shocks could be bad for them. And as you'll see in the video in just a second, the only thing the experimenter ever said is, you must continue. You must continue. If the teacher, which is, again, the participant, if he said to the experimenter, I don't think I should go on, I don't want to shock him anymore, the experimenter would just say that the experiment must go on. You must continue. That's all the experimenter did. And watch this video and you'll get a chance to see some of the stuff that was done. So very interesting stuff there. So again, the surprising result was that the majority of subjects were administering all the shocks, to the point where the rightmost one was listed as potentially lethal. They would hear the learner crying out in pain, demanding to be let out, noting bad heart condition, and most subjects continued to administer the shocks just because they were told to. Were these people bad people? Were they people who wanted to harm someone else? No, you saw that person in that video. He was legitimately distressed by administering those shocks. And virtually all subjects asked the supervising experimenter if they could stop, but as you heard, just told them to continue, and many of them did. And a lot of distress, but they just continued to do so. One of the quotes here was, "I observed a mature and initially poised businessman enter the laboratory smiling and confident. Within 20 minutes, he was reduced to a twitching, stuttering wreck who was rapidly approaching the point of nervous collapse. He constantly pulled his earlobe and twisted his hands." And this again is why this experiment is deemed so unethical, is because of how much distress it caused to the participants. This experiment would never get approval today simply because it caused so much distress to the participants. We get the interesting results in that is that many people will just follow orders to cause harm to others, but the unethical part of this one was that it was causing harm to the participants because they legitimately thought they were causing harm to others. So much was learned from the Milgram studies. They were very scientifically informative, even if they were unethical. We found out things like if the experimenter was immediate and the learner distant. So that's the condition that was shown in the first one, where the experimenter's in the room telling the participant to keep going, and the learner is not in the room, is in another room, that 65% of people basically went all the way with the shocks. That is a huge number. If both the experimenter and the learner were in the same room, still even 39% here went all the way. If the experimenter was immediate, but the learner was like right next to him, less so. And you see here, if the experimenter was distant, then the experimenter's not right there telling them what to do, then fewer basically followed. And if there was somebody else that was disobedient, if somebody else said, no, I won't shock them, only 10% were still willing to go all the way with shocking. But, and here's the other interesting side, and again, this isn't social psych, you get more of this in social psych, almost 95% of people, when in the presence of someone else that's willing to do the shocks, were willing to do themselves. So not only do we obey authority, but we conform to what other people are doing. So we have obedience and conformity. But again, the ethical problems with this study were that many of the participants experienced extreme stress in the short term. Some actually may have experienced long-term stress. Milgram did try to address this, but sometimes the participants disappeared, weren't able to be followed up on. And this is a big thing, this right here. Even though participants found out the information, I'm capable of harming someone, that can be actually detrimental to know that you have the ability to harm someone. Many people want to believe and are better off believing that they couldn't cause harm to someone. To have that illusion shattered, that can be detrimental. So because it's detrimental, that can be harmful, that's unethical. And deception was used. And it can be an acceptable tool for psychologists, but deception must be fully revealed at the end, and it must be basically all attempts must be made to alleviate any distress that was caused by the deception. So Milgram's debriefing didn't acknowledge that there were no shocks given, which is the big ethical concern, one of the big ethical concerns here. And even if they were told, so in later studies they were told that no shocks were given, if you don't have some form of counseling afterwards to remove the harmful effects of the deception, then it's still unethical. So an experiment like Milgram's study could be potentially done today, but it would have to be very controlled, and it would have to be done in such a way that the participants would get therapy afterwards to remove any potential negative effects, especially negative long-term effects, that occurred to the participants during the study. And it's something that because it's so difficult to do, most IRBs, most institutional review boards, won't even approve. So it's something you're not likely to ever see experiments like the Milgram experiments again, even in a very controlled setting. But the key takeaway here is that the ethical issues don't always arise only in medical research. So the ones we were talking about before with cancer, with syphilis, with hepatitis, things like that, those were medical research. But this Milgram study wasn't medical, it was psychological, and it still brought up some very big ethical concerns. And trade-offs are often inevitable. Gaining knowledge may require putting some people at risk of harm. It may require some deception. The question is the gain to the individuals and to society great enough that it outweighs the harm? And that is something that IRBs need to decide before approving any research. Is any potential harm outweighed by the benefits to both the individuals as part of the study, both the individuals, the participants in the study, as well as society as a whole? And quite often the answer is no. If there's harm to the participants, it's not justified. I have a colleague who did testosterone research on some participants, and he got it approved ethically to basically give the participants in the study a gel that was rubbed on them that removed testosterone from their body. It basically eliminated testosterone. And then half of the participants were given a testosterone replacement and half were given a placebo. So there's the potential of harm coming from this because while this study was going on, half of the participants did not have any testosterone in their body because the androgel, the thing that covered up the testosterone, basically stopped the production of testosterone in the body. Other participants may have had more testosterone than they had before because they got a testosterone supplement. So it's just one of those things that caused potential harm. The takeaways from the study were deemed to be large enough, as well as participants were fully informed before the study of what was going to happen. So there was no deception. The only deception was which group they were in, and they were only deceived until the study was over, and then they were told which group they were in, the placebo or the testosterone group. So trade-offs. It's a big component to, is research ethical or not? I know many other institutions that would have never approved that specific study just because those institutions would have deemed that the trade-offs weren't good enough. So going through it historically, looking at the things that came about because of unethical treatment. First, in 1947, and this is before many of those experiments I just talked about, 10 guidelines for ethical treatment for human subjects in research, the Nuremberg Code, were put out. Then the Declaration of Helsinki, right around that same time, provided international ethic guidelines for medical research. In the US, it wasn't until the 1960s that, and especially the late 1960s, that federally funded research proposals from public health services had to be reviewed for ethical treatment of subjects. And in 1974, the National Research Act mandated regulations for protection of subjects. Despite all of this, 40s, 50s, 60s, even early 70s. Despite all of this, unethical research continued. You saw some of those that were going on even after some of these things here. So unethical research just continued, and that's because there was no organized, no universal means for determining ethics in research. It wasn't until the Belmont Report in 1979 that looked at three different principles. The principle of respect for persons, the principle of beneficence, and the principle of justice was put out that basically is the guidelines that all modern IRBs and all modern ethics boards follow. So looking at that, again, the Tuskegee Syphilis Study, many other problematic studies, including in other countries, Nazi Germany, in Japan during World War II, there was many studies that were done. Just all of these different studies that were highly unethical. And scientists early on began outlining these ethical principles. However, again, like I said, none of them had teeth. They weren't enforced. The Nuremberg Code and Declaration of Helsinki were great. They had these good definitions, but they weren't enforced because they weren't universally accepted. It wasn't until the Belmont Conference in 1976 that in the U.S. it was brought together, and now much of the world follows the same principles, that physicians, philosophers, scientists came together and outlined those three principles, and they became the requirements for almost all U.S. research institutions to follow. Let's look at the Belmont principles. So the first one, as I said, is respect for persons. And that is to recognize that people are autonomous agents and allow them to make their own decisions about participation and give informed consent. That is a big word right here that we're going to adhere to for ethics. Informed consent. People cannot be participants in research without informed consent. There are exceptions. People can be participants in research if it is something that you're just taking, like, let's say you've got a public square that is known to have cameras on it. You can use what's on those cameras in research without getting informed consent of everybody there. However, if you're doing anything to participants specifically as part of the study, if you're bringing them into a lab, if you're doing anything like that, you need to get informed consent. There can be no coercion or undue influence, and I put the dollars here. I already talked about that. The money that's given for participating in research needs to be low enough that it's not going to coerce people into participating just for the money. And there needs to be special protections for vulnerable individuals and populations, such as minors, prisoners, and those with intellectual and developmental disabilities. This again came from those studies that did research on participants that were vulnerable and didn't take into ethical concern those groups. The next one is beneficence. And that is to treat people in ways that benefit society and the participants. Do not cause harm. And again, if harm is caused, it needs to be justified by benefits, usually to the individuals. Also, risks and benefits must be considered for study participants and communities. Risks such as their information getting out, as well as discomfort or other types of things. So the Milgram study. And one thing is these assessments of risks and benefits can be difficult. The IRB might not know how much harm the study is going to cause or how much benefit the study is going to have to society as a whole. So it's something that needs to be really considered, and IRBs tend to err on the side of caution when it comes to these types of things. And finally is respect for persons. Respect for persons was the first one. And finally is justice. So, and this is to, so this is to strive to treat all groups of people fairly. There must be a fair balance between the kinds of people who participate in research and the kinds of people who benefit from the research. For instance, studying tuberculosis amongst those who are institutionalized might be acceptable because they suffer most from the disease. Again, this is where the benefits, and this is beneficence comes in there, but the benefits need to justify any potential harm. The American Psychological Association has guidelines for all different things in psychology. So you get these 10 APA ethic code standards. Most of them are applied to things like clinicians, but there is one that's specifically for research. And these ethic guidelines for use and treatment of human participants in research, the first guidelines for protecting human subjects in research was 1973, and you notice that is just before the Belmont Conference. It's been updated and expanded many times, periodically reviewed. Again, there's these 10 standards. The rules must be followed, but only Standard 8 applies to research. And it specifically pertains to things like the IRB, that institutional review board, the group who decides if research is ethical or not. And it's so people who are on this IRB, you must have someone that's specific for animal research. You must have researchers. You also must on the IRB have at least one member of the general public, so someone who's not a researcher. So you get people who will decide on if it's ethical or not isn't just the people who are doing the research. So it's not like people are going to scratch their own backs or scratch the backs of their friends. You've got people that are on the IRB who are outside of the institution. It also basically talks about informed consent, deception, when deception is allowed, when it's not allowed, debriefing, so at the end of the research, debriefing the participants, talks about what to do in cases of research misconduct, and animal research is also included in the APA ethical standards. So again, like I said, you need someone who is specialized in animal research because a lot of psychological research is done on animals. And we want to make sure that the research done on animals is done in an ethical way as well. As far as the Institutional Review Board, the IRB, the common rule, it doesn't matter if you're, what field you're in. It doesn't matter if you're in the business school, the philosophy department, the English department, the psychology department. If you're collecting data on living humans, you probably need to obtain approval from the IRB and must conform to the same ethical standards. There are exceptions. If you're doing archival research is where the data has already been collected and you're just running new information on it. Quite often you don't need to get IRB approval. Sometimes if there's the potential of basically the participants' identities getting out, then you still need to go through the IRB again. Like I said before, if you're taking recordings from public and running research on that, don't need to get informed consent. One of my research studies was on the facial width to height ratio, how wide people's faces are to height of hockey players. I didn't need to get informed consent from the hockey players because their pictures were already out there. It was freely available. And there wasn't any chance of like in the individual's information getting out because all of the information was already public knowledge. How many penalty minutes a player has, that's public knowledge. Things like that. The IRB attempts to guarantee that the research as described protects the rights of human participants according to the detailed federal guidelines and ethical principles. The IRB is not supposed to screen out controversial but ethical research. Not supposed to, sometimes it does. I know people who, I have told you before, one of my big loves is evolutionary psychology. I know people at some schools who try and run evolutionary psychology research get it rejected every time because some people on the IRB don't agree with evolutionary psychology. They don't agree with evolution. They don't agree with evolutionary psychology. So that's one thing to just be aware of. It's not supposed to screen out controversial but ethical research, but sometimes it does. Other schools, that's not an issue, that's not a problem, but some places it is. Just quick tangent aside, I have a colleague in Halifax, and she is at a Catholic college there, and interestingly enough, she has gotten not only IRB approval, but funding from the school to get a Playboy subscription because she was doing research on waist-to-hip ratio. Waist-to-hip ratio, again, is a measure mainly in women. It can be measured in men as well, but mainly in women as a sign of fertility. Waist-to-hip ratio closer to 0.7 is indicative of higher fertility, but that's besides the point. She got was basically got funded for by the college a lifetime subscription to Playboy so she could go back through all the previous Playboy issues and get the waist to hip ratio change in Playboy models over time. So again, it could be a controversial, but you can still get approval as long as it's following ethical guidelines. So every institution or agency is required to establish a institutional review board committee. It has to be composed of both scientists and non-scientists, as well as someone from the inside the institution, outside the institution, and it examines any proposed research involving humans and animals. And there's 7 criteria that need to be followed: minimizing the risk to participants, reasonable risk in relation to the benefits. So if there is risk, there has to be, the benefits have to justify it. There has to be equitable selection so that disadvantaged groups don't get selected. There's very strict guidelines on if you want to do research on even those that are under the age of 18. You have to get parental permission. You have to fill out special forms in your IRB proposal. All of that just to get it allowed to have people underage as part of your participants. There needs to be informed consent. So the participants need to be able to give consent to participating, and they need to give consent to the research that's going to be conducted. So you have to have an informed consent that details the research that's going to be conducted. There needs to be documentation of that. I still have documentation of every study I've done, the informed consent for every participant that's been in every study I've ever done. It's one of those things that needs to be kept. Data monitoring. Why is data monitoring so important? Because confidentiality is a very important part of research. This privacy and confidentiality. So data monitoring is important so that privacy and confidentiality is kept. Another important component of ethical research is no harm. Subjects must be protected from both physical as well as psychological harm. Again, as we've discussed a few times, sometimes some harm is allowed if it's justified by the results, but in general, you have to follow the no harm. For instance, one of the famous studies, you've probably heard of it, is the Stanford Prison Experiment, where some people were assigned the role of prisoners and some people were assigned the role of guards. The study actually had to be prematurely ended due to subjects' behavior. The guards had started physically harming the prisoners, even though they were just arbitrarily decided who was the prisoners and who was the guards. So the researchers, even the IRB, didn't expect any harm to come from it, but as soon as the participants started enacting harm, as soon as they started harming each other, the study had to be ended immediately. Next one, informed consent. So this is where the subjects must be informed of all available information about the study so that they can make a rational decision whether to participate or not. So there must be, the information must be there. But not only must the information be there, it has to be understandable. So you have to write out your informed consent in such a way that the expected participants can understand it. And then there's the final, that's the voluntary participation, and that goes along with the informed consent. And as I've been saying, the standards for each step of the process do depend on the risks and the benefits. Checking someone's mental state with a licensed professional might not be necessary if the study is might be necessary. Sorry. Checking someone's mental state might be necessary if you're studying an antipsychotic. If you're just asking someone to complete a survey about recycling, you don't have to check their mental state ahead of time. You don't have to check and see if it's going to cause them to distress being part of the study, because no distress is expected to come from the study, which does lead to deception. So deception is defined as a participant not being fully informed about the true nature of the research before deciding to participate. And deception is in general not allowed. Now, that being said, some studies require deception. And what you actually find is, so it may be allowed, and it comes in two forms: passive deception, where you're admitting something, or active deception, where you're committing a deception, where you've got things like Confederates. In my study, I used deception, so they were not only told that they were going to be put in a waiting room when it was really part of the study, the study room, but they also encountered a Confederate who they thought was part of, who was another participant there, not part of the study. So there was both passive and active deception that occurred. There is actually a push now to reduce the amount of allowed deception. Why is that the case? Because many participants in psychology studies go in immediately expecting there to be deception, because deception has been used so much. So really there's some guidelines that need to be followed. First, any deception, the benefit must outweigh the risk, should only be used when it cannot be avoided. And it really comes down, that's a really important one. If there's any way to avoid deception, it should be avoided, simply because there's this prevailing opinion that all psychology studies use deception, so you must be deceiving me if I'm here for a study. And the only way to get around that is to stop using deception in most studies. And a lot of people will believe, well, a lot of researchers will say that deception's needed because participants act different when they're not being deceived. And the science actually shows that that's not the case. Even when participants know they're getting a placebo, the placebo effect occurs. So deception isn't always necessary. You cannot conceal factors that may cause physical harm or severe emotional distress, and must provide a debriefing after participation. So this is like with mine, after participants engaged with the Confederate, they thought they were in a waiting room, they thought they were talking to somebody that was just another participant. Then they went and filled out surveys. After that, I then informed them, I told them, or the researcher that was there, because I was never the primary researcher there because I knew too much about the study. So my research assistants, whichever one was in charge of the study that day, they would tell the participants that they were deceived, that when they thought they were in a waiting room, they were actually being recorded, that the person who sat across from them was actually part of the study, all of that. And quite often they'll say, I knew it, or I had a suspicion, stuff like that. But again, this goes back to deception is used so often that it's just kind of viewed now as ubiquitous. It's going to happen in studies. So let's look at a kind of an experiment here that was done, where they wanted to test whether interacting with a gun rather than a non-violent toy increased aggressiveness. They realized, though, as part of the study, that after interacting with the gun, participants might think that they ought to act more aggressively. So they told participants that their interaction with the gun was to evaluate how well they could describe an object's details. So they used deception here. They still knew they were interacting with a gun, but instead of just interacting with the gun, the researchers thought that without deception that would actually influence behavior. So they did deception here, active deception, to tell them they just had to describe it. And then to measure aggressiveness, they did a hot sauce thing here. I told you guys about this, but hot sauce in a drink to the next person is a measure of aggressiveness. The more hot sauce you add, the more aggressive you're being. Numerous studies use this as one measure of aggressiveness. In a sense, the experimenter used this deceptive cover story so that participants' expectations wouldn't be influenced by their behavior. It was an act of deception, but was it severe? No, it was a very minor deception that occurred. It's fairly typical, and at the end of the study, they would have been debriefed about it. Which gets us to the debriefing. The debriefing occurs at the end of a study, and its purpose is to relate the nature of the study as well as to ensure the well-being of participants, allow any questions about the research, those types of things. So the participants have a chance, the researcher has a chance to see if the participants are okay, there was no harm done. The participants have a chance to ask questions, and any deceptions are revealed. So during this, the deception becomes revealed and explained why it's necessary. You can't just say, hey, you were in the room at this point in time with a Confederate, and you were being recorded. You can't just say that the deception occurred. You've got to say that. Then you've got to say, we deceived you because we wanted to see what your natural behavior would be. And the belief is that if you knew you were being recorded and interacting with someone who's part of the study, that would change your behavior. And you always ask if they were suspicious before, because there's this belief that if they're suspicious, it might change their behavior. It's one of the things that you ask in a survey, and then you just do some stats on it to see if it affected the study. In general, it usually doesn't. Like I said, some people were like, oh, I suspected it, or I thought that was what was going on. Even then, that didn't change their behavior enough for it to affect the results when I looked at it statistically. And if harm was caused, if any changes were caused during the study, the debriefing or the process debriefing would be required to reduce that. I have another colleague who did a study, wanted to look at people's their inebriation. So if they drank alcohol, how that affected their decision making in a task when in this one they played a video game, and they had to it was guys, and they had to approach a female in the video game, and they had choices on what to say and what to do in this, and they were trying to see what alcohol's effect on their decision making was. Well, one of the parts of their debriefing was they could not let the participants leave until their blood alcohol level came back down to a normal level. So they had basically a waiting room after the study that the participants had to sit in for a few hours after the study to come back to their alcohol level to get back down. And sometimes debriefing may involve asking participants if they had participated in the study previously, if they knew anything about the study prior to participating, if they answered all questions honestly. Just things like this are general questions that you can use to help with your stats later. So going back to this guns, testosterone, and aggression, what it comes down to here is they had a process debriefing where the subjects listened to relaxing music before they left in order to return them to a normal arousal level. So if handling the gun did increase their aggression, what they did is they had this relaxing music afterwards that was designed to bring them down to a normal level. The next main component of the IRB and ethical research is confidentiality. So you need anonymity throughout your entire study. Any attitudes or opinions, any measured performance, any demographic characteristics, anything you measure about your participants needs to be kept confidential. And so you get participants to sign informed consent. However, when they sign informed consent, what they need to do is they're given their name and everything. So when they sign informed consent, they're putting their name on it. And you can't tie that informed consent paper to their information that they do in the study. So any survey results, any behavioral or physiological measures you get from them, you cannot tie that to them. So what usually ends up happening is you get they get a code, and the code is put on their informed consent thing, and then the code is put on everything else. So it can be tied through their name, but at the same time, those papers, those informed consent papers, are locked in a filing cabinet that only the principal investigator has the key to. That's actually one of the things that the IRB is very adamant about, is that the informed consent paperwork is locked up and only the primary investigator has access to that paperwork. We've been talking about humans to this point, but let's actually look at in non-humans for a minute. So in non-humans, you still have this issue of ethics. So the question becomes, is it ethical to use animals in behavioral research? Researchers do use non-human subjects to understand animals for their own sakes, but also to understand humans via generalizations from animals. And they conduct a lot of research on animals that's impossible to conduct with human subjects. The ethical guidelines for doing research on animals is looser than it is in doing research on humans. And I'm not going to get into a debate about whether that's good or bad, but researchers are allowed to do things with animals that they are not allowed to do on humans. I've used an example in the past about you can't intentionally impregnate women as trying to see if pregnancy affects something in your study. However, with animals, you can intentionally impregnate individuals to see if that pregnancy affects how they respond in that study. But there are ethical guidelines for use and treatment of non-human subjects in research. It includes general care and maintenance of animal subjects and governing housing conditions, food, sanitation, medical care for research animals. The point is, and we'll go into this a little bit more detail in the next few slides, but the point is, or in the next slide, the point is, though, that very few cases of unethical research on animals have been found. Because there is these, at least in modern times, because there is these ethical guidelines that research labs must follow when it comes to doing research on animals. For the federal government requires researchers using non-human subjects to follow the following guidelines. First is the Guidelines for Institutional Animal Care and Use Committee. And they have to review and approve all institutional research using animal subjects. And there needs to be at least one veterinarian, one scientist experienced with research in animal subjects, and one member of the general public there as part of this group that approves the research. And there's specific guidelines that must be followed. There's specific guidelines from the U.S. Department of Agriculture, the U.S. state, and that are within the academic discipline of the researcher. So there is some pretty strict guidelines out there for research on animals. Let's move on to the last topic then, and that is ethical issues and scientific integrity. So prior to this, we've been talking about ethical issues as it pertains to research. Now we're going to talk about ethical issues as it pertains to publishing research or data reporting. So there's two main things to look at here. The first is fraud, and the second is plagiarism. Let's look at fraud first. So fraud in science is the explicit effort of a researcher to falsify or misrepresent data. Rather than just committing an error, This is a case where a researcher is actively lying or deceiving with their results. So you hear about this every few years. You hear about some major social scientist who's maybe working at Harvard or or Yale or any of those big universities, who it turns out that they went back and looked at his data and he was actively lying, or she was actively lying about their research, was actively making up results. And why do they do this? Well, why would they commit fraud? A big reason is to remain competitive in the academic environment. So when you look at academic environments at research institutions, research universities, places like U of M, those types of universities are very, very competitive. They are extremely competitive. To get hired for a position there it takes, you have to have many publications. And not only do you have to have many publications, you also have to have many high value publications. So it isn't just about presenting your research to people, it's about presenting your research in journals that are really well viewed. And then once you get there, to get tenure at a tenure track university like that, you have to continue publishing. And what gets published in good journals? Really big findings, positive findings, findings where you get a result that is consistent with what you predicted. What doesn't really get published or gets published in lower journals? Negative findings, null findings. So if you're trying to do a research to see if anxiety has an effect on test-taking ability, and you find that it doesn't, you can still publish that work. You're just not going to get it published in a good journal, and it's much less likely to get published. So there's this whole publisher perish mentality at research institutions, in that to keep on going, to get hired, to keep on getting promoted, to get tenure, things like that, you need to continue publishing. Well, what is the most likely to continue getting published, and as well as what is getting published in journals? That is big findings that are actual results. And what ends up happening is that some researchers then lie about their results to get their results published. They might get a null finding. They might find that anxiety doesn't relate to test performance, and they then lie and say it does. And when in actuality, I'm using that as an example, in actuality, anxiety is related to test performance. It actually has a curvilinear relationship with test performance. That is, low anxiety and high anxiety result in poor test performance. A moderate amount of anxiety results in best test performance. But that's besides the point. Let's say there was no relationship. Well, a researcher might lie and say there is a relationship. They do a test, they do a study, they check the results of their study, the results weren't consistent with what they predicted, and then they manufacture or adjust the data to basically show that there's an effect when there really wasn't an effect. And they do that in order to keep publishing so that they can keep their job or get a better job, that type of thing. There are safeguards in place to prevent this, though. The studies are designed to be replicated. And if a study gets replicated, and replication essentially means where a study is conducted again, if a study is conducted again, and they don't find the same results, well, that calls into question the initial results. Now, sometimes all that means is that the initial results are just believed to be an error. And this does happen where results are in error. Not intentional, not malicious error, just random error. But it might start to call into question if somebody's has 2 or 3, maybe 4 studies that have been attempted to be replicated and they haven't been replicated. This is why there is a big push in psychology or in the behavioral sciences to do replication experiments, to fund replications. Again, replication experiments, they're not big and flashy. They're not the new thing, but they do help control for fraud in science. Another big thing is research articles are peer reviewed. Peer review is an important part of the academic process. That is, when you go to publish an article in a journal, before it gets published in that journal, it gets sent out to reviewers who understand the topic matter, who look it over and look through the stats, look through things to make they can't tell for sure that fraud has been committed, but it reduces the chance that fraud has been committed. And another big one is data must be shared with others upon request. So the data that you obtained, if it's requested by someone for them to look over your data for consistency, you must share it to see so they can check to see if it's correct. This rarely gets done, but it does get done, especially if these replication studies start to not be able to replicate a couple of your studies. People will ask for your data so that they can check everything. And the consequences of being found guilty of fraud are a big deterrent. Anybody who's found guilty of lying in science, in the behavioral sciences, is basically barred from working at any academic institution and doing any academic research after that. They lose their job, they can't get another job. It is a very big deterrent there to continue doing fraud. That doesn't mean people don't do it, because every year people are found doing it. Like I said, usually at the really big research universities, simply because of that publish or perish mentality. The other side of ethical issues and scientific integrity is plagiarism. And this gets us to our learning objective 5, because this is an important one, and that is be able to demonstrate an understanding of how to avoid committing plagiarism, because you guys are going to be writing up a research report throughout the semester, and you need to demonstrate that you are not plagiarizing someone else's ideas. What is plagiarism? It's the unethical representation of someone else's ideas or words as your own. It can occur at a variety of different levels, and it may be deliberate, or it can even be happening without your direct knowledge. And if it is occurring without your direct knowledge, then obviously it's not malicious, but by understanding what plagiarism is more, there's less likely of a chance of it occurring this way. Maybe you heard something a year ago and you don't even remember hearing it, you read about it, and then you go to do some research on your own, or you go to write up a paper, and you think of something, and you think of that same thing, not even realizing that you'd heard it before, and you think it's your own idea, and you write it down as if it's your own idea. That's still plagiarism. How can we correct for that? That becomes very difficult. But that is why understanding what you're writing and what you're writing about is very important, because then you understand better when you are committing plagiarism. Went really weird at the end of that last slide. Sorry about the silence there. But looking at here, so original text from Quirin, Kazin, and Cole said, are affective experiences like happiness, sadness, or helplessness always amenable to self-report? Whereas many individuals may be able to describe their affective states or traits relatively accurately, others may provide self-reports that deviate from their automatic affective reactions. So this is the original report. Let's look at some instances of plagiarism for plagiarizing from this. The first is repeating large sections of text verbatim is clearly plagiarism even with a citation. If you're repeating a lot of what was said and not in quotes, and you shouldn't use quotes anyway, or you should rarely use quotes, but let's say you didn't use quotes and you repeated a lot of what it was the same. Are people really in touch with their emotional responses? For example, are feelings like happiness, sadness, or helplessness always available for self-report? That's basically word for word what was there before. Whereas many individuals may be able to describe their feelings relatively accurately, others may provide self-reports that deviate from their true reactions. That's essentially what was said before. There isn't enough deviation, there isn't enough difference in what was just said here from the original. It wasn't put in the person writing this' own words. So even though you've got the citation here, that is still plagiarism because the person who was writing this didn't put it in their own words. You can have some words that are the same. You can have even the order of things be the same, but you need to put it in your own words so that you basically are understanding what's being said and you're conveying that, and then you're attributing it back to the original source. Changing a few words is still plagiarism, even with a citation. Are feelings like happiness, sadness, or helplessness always available for self-report? So 1 or 2 words was changed there, but it's still the same thing. Whereas many individuals may be able to describe their feelings relatively accurately, others may provide self-reports that deviate from their true reactions. So there's a few words that are different there. There's the, instead of saying deviate from their automatic effective reactions, it's deviating from their true reactions. That's just 1 word that was changed there. 2 words became 1. It comes down to the fact that essentially the same thing is being said without putting it in your own words. Changing 1 or 2 words does not change it to enough for it to not be plagiarism. So again, this is also plagiarism. Changing most of the wording but keeping the same structure and other ideas is a step towards paraphrasing, but is still plagiarism. So you change most of the words, but you keep the exact same structure. It's basically the same thing as you read before. Is it easy for people to report their feelings? Whereas before it said, are affective experiences like happiness, sadness, or helplessness always amenable to self-report? Although some people may be able to give accurate reports, and before it said, whereas many individuals may be able to describe their affective states, others fail to provide accurate descriptions of how they feel, whereas before it was others may provide self-reports that deviate. It's essentially the same thing, just words were changed in each sentence. So you have to not necessarily change up the full structure, but it can't be almost verbatim with different words. So again, that's plagiarism as well. You need to put it in your own words. You need to put it in your own words in such a way that it's understandable, that you are the one conveying this, even if this is the source you got it from. You got the idea from this source, but you understand that source enough that you were able to put it in your own words. So in review here, we first looked at ethics with the learning objective, identify ethical concerns in research. Then we looked at some of the history of unethical research. So the learning objective there was describe some of the major historical studies and their corresponding ethical violations. Then we looked at the Belmont report with the learning objective there to list the 3 ethical principles of the Belmont report. We looked at APA Standard 8 with the learning objective to understand the APA Standard 8 guidelines and how they apply to research. We also looked at a little bit with animal ethics in there, and then finished up with fraud and plagiarism with that learning objective 5, the most important one of all of these, that being able to demonstrate an understanding of how to avoid committing plagiarism. That's all I have for you today. Thanks. Come on back.